He took everything we built, selling our soul to the highest bidder. But he forgot one crucial detail about the foundation. It started with lukewarm coffee and a slow, cold realization. Marcus had sold our source code, and he was taking the glory with it. The coffee in my mug was lukewarm, a perfect reflection of my mood. It was that dull, gray, slightly bitter feeling that settles in your chest when you realize the foundation beneath your entire world isn't just shaking, it's actively crumbling. I sat in the quiet hum of the open-plan office, staring at the screen, and felt the familiar, cold not tighten. It wasn't the project deadline that was killing me. I was a seasoned veteran. I thrive under pressure. It was the betrayal. It was the sheer, audacious, calculated stupidity of Marcus Thorne. For 5 years, we had built NovaStream. We started in a garage smelling faintly of stale pizza and ambition. We poured our lifeblood into it, late nights fueled by cheap energy drinks, weekends sacrificed, every spare moment dedicated to smoothing out a bug or optimizing a line of code. We were small, scrappy, brilliant, and we were ours. The intellectual property, the proprietary algorithms, the entire structural DNA of NovaStream resided in our shared repository, guarded by us. Marcus, our chief technical officer, was supposed to be the guardian. He was the charismatic face, the smooth talker who could charm venture capitalists out of their spreadsheets. He was the visionary, the one who convinced us that we weren't just building software. We were building the next platform, the connective tissue of the digital age. I, on the other hand, was the architect, the one who wrote the core engine, the beast that actually made the streams flow. We had a partnership that felt symbiotic, almost familial. We argued, sure. We fought over naming conventions, over deployment schedules, over the appropriate level of corporate jargon to use in a pitch deck. But the core trust, the fundamental belief that when the chips were down, Marcus wouldn't throw us under the bus, that was granite. Then came the Series C funding round. The pressure ramped up to a near unbearable pitch. Marcus, sweating through a tailored linen shirt, was running point. He was performing beautifully, reciting our milestones like scripture. But beneath the polished veneer, I saw the subtle flicker of panic in his eyes. He was overextending. He was promising growth curves that were, frankly, optimistic at best, and delusional at worst. The tipping point came during the final presentation to Zenith Capital. The lead partner, a woman named Elena Vance, whose gaze felt like a forensic audit, leaned forward, her expression unreadable. She asked the million-dollar question, the one that always makes the engineers tense up. Marcus, regarding the foundational IP, the proprietary sorting matrix that allows NovaStream to handle latency at this scale. Who holds the primary license? Is it company-owned, or is there a key individual contribution? Marcus didn't hesitate. He smiled, a little too wide, a little too practiced. He looked directly at me, a flash of something that looked like patronizing amusement crossing his face. And then he delivered the killing blow. Elena, he said, his voice ringing with manufactured confidence. While the code is integrated into the corporate structure, the original, foundational architecture, the core engine you are seeing today, was developed primarily by Alex. He gestured to me, and frankly, by myself overseeing the final integration. However, for simplicity of acquisition, we have a clean assignment agreement, which clearly states that the primary, transferable IP ownership resides with the entity, NovaStream Corp. But to be perfectly transparent, my contribution, combined with Alex's, represents the vast majority of the value. And to expedite the sale, I've already signed a preliminary option agreement that solidifies my stake as the controlling majority shareholder. The air in the room went still. My gut twisted. He hadn't just stated ownership. He had subtly, masterfully stripped me of my foundational credit. He had positioned himself not as the visionary overseer, but as the necessary gatekeeper. He was positioning himself to take the largest piece of the pie, leaving me with a respectable, but subordinate, slice. Elena Vance, bless her ruthless soul, didn't blink. She just nodded slowly. Very transparent, Marcus, and very convenient. So, you are essentially selling the company, but you are ensuring you attain the controlling interest post-acquisition, correct? Precisely, Marcus chirped, basking in the glow of his self-promotion. A win-win. Zenith gets the platform, and we ensured the architects remain in the driver's seat. A win-win. What? The only thing Marcus was ensuring was that he was in the driver's seat, with me relegated to the co-pilot seat, perpetually waiting for him to signal a turn. He hadn't just sold our source code. He had sold the narrative of our creation, and in doing so, he had sold me out. He was monetizing my genius without truly sharing the burden or the glory. That evening, the rage didn't explode. explode. It simmered. It didn't roar. It hissed, hot and precise, like coolant escaping a finely tuned engine under extreme duress. I didn't go home to watch a movie or unwind with a drink. I went to my home office, the room where the ghost of NovaStream lived, and I started working. The initial rush was pure adrenaline. My fingers flew across the keyboard, a blur of movement that was almost violent in its speed. I wasn't fixing bugs. I was performing surgery. I was dissecting the core repository, the sacred vault, and identifying every single line of code that was undeniably, indisputably mine. The proprietary sorting matrix, the recursive data threading algorithm, the unique compression layer that made our whole system breathe. They were all tagged, documented, and meticulously quarantined. Marcus had his assignment agreement. Yes, he had the corporate shell, but the agreement was predicated on the idea that IP was his unit, inseparable whole. He had underestimated the granularity of my obsession. He thought he could buy the whole loaf and just slice off the biggest chunk. I started by creating a clean, hermetically sealed fork of the entire codebase, one that was entirely independent of the NovaStream Corp structure. Then, the revenge began in earnest. I didn't just copy it, I improved it. I didn't just archive it, I weaponized it. I started stripping away the layers of corporate bloat that Marcus and his managerial enthusiasm had added over the years. The unnecessary logging functions, the superfluous API wrappers designed purely for investor comfort, the legacy dependencies he insisted on keeping for backward compatibility. I pruned the beast back to its most elegant, efficient, brutal core. Then came the enhancements. I implemented a new, predictive caching layer that would shave milliseconds off latency. Milliseconds that, at scale, translate to millions and save processing power. I optimized the threading model using a pattern Marcus had dismissed as too niche for the main build, but which I knew was the future. It was beautiful. It was lean. It was mine. The turning point was the dramatic confrontation. It was a quiet, almost spiritual moment around 3 a.m. The revised, optimized, pure Alex core version, let's call it NovaStream Prime, was running perfectly in a sandbox environment. It was faster, cleaner, more elegant, and fundamentally superior to the version Marcus had sold to Zenith Capital. In that moment, the simmering rage didn't dissipate. It crystallized. It hardened into purpose. The resentment shifted from a hot, blinding fury to a cold, razor-sharp clarity. This wasn't about being angry anymore. This was about correcting a historical error, a theft, a gross misappraisal of genius. Marcus had taken the core IP and sold it as a finished product, a jewel box. But I had just taken that jewel box, cracked it open, polished the stones, and replaced the flimsy velvet lining with reinforced titanium. The next morning, the atmosphere at NovaStream Corp was tense. Marcus was booming in the morning scrum, preening as he explained how the Zenith integration was going smoothly, how the initial performance benchmarks were exceeding expectations, and the stability team, he announced, tapping his stylus against the whiteboard, is rock solid. The core matrix is performing exactly as promised, reliable, scalable, and utterly proprietary to our ownership structure. I waited for my cue. He was mid-sentence, waxing poetic about the synergistic relationship between the code and the corporate vision. When I finally spoke, my voice was quiet, but it cut through the ambient office chatter like a perfectly tuned frequency. With respect, Marcus, I said, meeting his gaze, not flinching under the weight of his expectation. That's a simplification. The matrix isn't just performing as promised, it's performing better than promised. Significantly better. He paused, a flicker of annoyance crossing his features. Better how? Alex? More elegantly, I presume. More efficiently, I corrected him, letting the word hang there, heavy with implication. The optimizations we implemented post-integration have resulted in a measured 14% reduction in average latency and a 9% improvement in resource utilization. It's the core engine, Marcus. It's running cleaner than the version you presented to Zenith. He frowned, a genuine crease forming between his eyebrows. This was not the polite deference he was used to. That's interesting. Were those adjustments made by the development team, or did you personally oversee those refinements? I oversaw them, I confirmed, leaning slightly into the conversation, ensuring everyone within earshot could catch the admission. I built the core, and then I perfected it. He tried to recover, the smooth talk mechanism kicking back into gear. Well, that speaks to the strength of our team synergy, but those refinements are now part of the corporate asset, Alex. They are integrated into the official NovaStream IP, which Zenith now owns. But that's where your assumption of totality is flawed, Marcus, I countered, letting a small, satisfied smile touched my lips. You assumed the IP was a single monolithic block. It is not. It is a complex, multi-layered structure. The original IP you sold to Zenith is the chassis, the foundation, but the significant value addition, the performance leap, that is the engine upgrade. And the upgrade, Marcus, is mine. He started to sputter, his polished facade beginning to crack around the edges. He knew this was a fight, and he hated losing gracefully. You can't just claim that, he insisted, his voice rising. It's been absorbed into the corporate ledger. It has been integrated, I corrected him, emphasizing the subtle but crucial difference. And integration does not equal sole ownership. You sold them the right to use the foundational code under a specific licensing tier. They own the house, Marcus, but they do not own the patent on the hyper-efficient, bespoke 8-track system that is running it. He looked genuinely flustered now, his carefully constructed narrative momentarily derailed by my precision. So, what are you suggesting? He challenged, his tone shifting from dismissive annoyance to genuine threat. That you are claiming a massive, unassigned equity stake based on a refinement? I am suggesting, I said, letting the words settle again, heavier this time, that my refinement is not a refinement. It is a superior, independently verifiable, and wholly original iteration of the core IP. And since the original assignment agreement did not explicitly state that all subsequent, significant, proprietary enhancements automatically transfer to the corporate entity without further negotiation, then, legally speaking, the engine upgrade remains under my direct IP control. He was scrambling, trying to find the loophole, the clause that would let him sweep this under the rug. But I had anticipated this. I had prepared for this. You'd have to license it separately, he muttered, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. Precisely. And that license, I continued, the victory tasting sweet and sharp on my tongue, would be structured to reflect its value, a substantial royalty stream payable directly to me, the original architect of the refinement, a percentage of the revenue generated specifically by the efficiency gains. He was silent for a long moment, staring at me as if seeing me for the first time, not as the dependable, slightly quiet co-pilot, but as the dangerous, brilliant engine room operator. And what if he finally managed, his voice low and laced with grudging respect, the board decides to push back? What if they argue that the refinement was a logical extension of the foundational? I let the smile widen, this time not patronizing, but triumphant. This was the moment, the final, glorious unveiling. Then Marcus, I said, leaning in until our eyes locked, we negotiate. But know this, I have already done something more definitive than merely claim a royalty stream. I reached into the sleek tablet case resting beside my keyboard, pulled out a single, encrypted file, and tapped it open. The screen displayed a document titled NovaStream Prime IP Transfer and Liquidation Agreement. While you were busy selling the house, I explained, my voice dropping to a conspiratorial, yet authoritative, whisper. I didn't just create a better engine. I created a functionally superior, fully self-contained, and perfectly clean alternative product. I didn't just claim the IP of the refinement. I packaged it into a viable, market-ready competitor. He blinked, genuinely stunned. The agreement outlines 3 things, I continued, tapping the screen again. First, the perpetual licensing of NovaStream Prime to NovaStream Corp at a tiered, favorable rate. Second, a minimum 15% royalty on all revenue generated by the optimized matrix. And third, I paused, letting the weight of the final point settle over him, the right to liquidate the entire NovaStream Prime IP portfolio, should the relationship between the core team and the corporation become untenable. Marcus stared at the screen, his mouth slightly agape. He hadn't just bought the best part of the cake, he'd been handed the deed to the whole bakery, with the option to sell it off piecemeal or absorb it. Liquidation, he finally echoed, the words sounding thin, almost reedy. Yes, I confirmed. If the board decides that the version you sold them is too cumbersome, too tied to your management vision, or simply doesn't meet the next round of insane growth projections you've set for yourself, they can't just toss NovaStream out the window. They have to decide, do they keep the clunky, overpriced, slightly slow asset you championed, or do they adopt my lean, efficient, superior Prime? I pause, letting him absorb the sheer, devastating power of the move. And should they decide to adopt Prime, I finish, leaning back in my chair, the tension finally draining out of my shoulders, replaced by a deep, settling calm. They don't just pay the license fee. They pay the premium. They pay the cost of re-architecting their entire operational framework to accommodate the superior code. They pay for the elegance. They pay for the speed. Marcus Thorne, the man who thought he was the visionary, The master architect, the one who controlled the narrative, suddenly looked very much like a highly paid, slightly nervous tenant standing in a mansion owned by a quiet, infinitely more capable tenant who had secretly upgraded the entire infrastructure without ever asking permission. He swallowed hard, his bravado finally giving way to a flash of pure, unadulterated fear, the fear of being obsolete. So he breathed, slowly pushing himself upright. You are saying you can make NovaStream better than Zenith expected, and force them to buy it at a premium, all while retaining the ultimate exit strategy. More than that, Marcus, I corrected him gently, picking up my now lukewarm, but suddenly perfectly acceptable coffee mug. I'm saying that while you were busy selling our source code, you didn't actually buy the intellectual property. You bought the license to use it. And I, the actual creator, have kept the title deed. And trust me, Marcus, the closing date on that deed is coming much sooner than you think.